and it is 6:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Barbara Lee Van Horsen. I am the experimenter for the Momentum Center, which is a grassroots movement to create a stigma-free community. And we have convened the Anti-Racism Task Force, which consists of all of these wonderful agencies that you see here, about 35 people. Who are really committed to addressing racism in our community. And one of the ways we're doing that is through hosting these monthly town hall meetings on race and racism. And we'll talk about our format because it's different than a lot of town hall meetings. But first I need to issue a warning. Last month, we had our inaugural town hall and we were hacked. This time we have security on the call or on the whole Zoom meeting, 2 people whose whole purpose is to look for anybody infiltrating the meeting and getting them out as quickly as possible. We recognize that despite all of the barriers that we've put in place, people can circumvent those things. And so that's why we're going to assume somebody's going to try to hack us tonight, and we're going to be prepared to remove that. But I do want to give the heads up that that did happen, and people were subjected to offensive language and pictures and videos. So just be aware that that happened, that we're taking all the precautions we can to not allow that to happen again. And if it does, we'll remove people immediately. But I just need you to know that that is the risk in having a public forum meeting. We don't know everybody who's signing on, so we can't necessarily know who to let in and who not to let in. But we will be watching that. And a special thanks to Brian Wheeler and Cecil from Grand Haven Area Public Schools. They are also allowing us to use their Zoom, which gives us additional security features. So really, really grateful. Thank you, men, for your assistance. So this is our town hall, our second town hall on race and racism, and our topic is racism and the media. As I mentioned, these are all of the organizations that have brought this together. And we're working on not just conversations, but what are the ideas that come out of the conversations and creating action lists. So some of the things that are happening so far is we do have a pretty robust resource list that Jane Stoker's been helping to assemble. The link for that list is here. We encourage you to go there. There's video, movies, books, young adult books, a whole array of resources and references there. Wes McGee is putting together the outline for an adult book club, and Angelica is interested in leading a young adult book club if there's interest in those areas. And we have our topic for November lined up, which is ethnic intimidation. Our panelists tonight include C.E. Sickinga, who is a teacher at Grand Haven High School. He teaches journalism there. He's also the past president of Michigan Interscholastic Press Association. We have Kylie Ambu who is from WZZM 13. She's a news anchor and also a member of the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force at WZZM. Kylie had actually signed up to be part of our town hall last month and then had a story she had to cover. And when she tried to come in, by then we had locked the meeting. So we're glad that she's able to join us today, not just as a participant, but also as a panelist. And Sarah Leach is with us, who is the executive editor of the Holland Sentinel. So we've tried to get panelists that represent different parts of the media, and we're really excited to hear from them. But first, we have a little instructions to go over. Our agenda for tonight is we start with this welcome, some instructions. We have some initial polling questions, and then we'll hear from each of our panelists. They'll each speak for 10 minutes. And then we'll have a Q&A period. Questions have been submitted ahead of time, which we have already passed on. There were some questions that were not pertinent to this particular topic that we'll be holding for when we talk to government officials or police, other officials that will deal with those questions that have come in. But those that pertain to our topic tonight, we've given. And then we encourage you to put questions in the chat box. So if you asked a question and you didn't hear an answer, put it there, or if new questions come up, put it there, and we will ask those tonight. If we don't have time to get through all of the questions, we'll ask our panelists for a written response, and we'll send that all out in the packet afterward. We are recording the session, and you'll all get a copy of the recording and any materials as well. After the Q&A portion, we will go into our breakout sessions. That's where you'll go into a small group with an assigned facilitator. All the groups will be given the same questions. You'll talk about that in your group. Your facilitator will take notes, and then we'll just do a really fast 10-second soundbite about the nature of your conversation when we come back together. There'll be some ending polling questions, and then we'll talk about next steps. So instructions for tonight, one is to please stay on mute unless you're asked to talk. Obviously, when you're in your small group, you'll want to unmute. And our facilitators and our panelists, as you're called on, please unmute yourself. We do have closed captioning tonight, so that is an option. If you want to turn your closed captioning off, you can choose to do that by clicking at the buttons at the bottom of your screen. If you want to participate in the breakout sessions, you do need to have the Zoom app. You can't do that from the web base. And as I mentioned, next steps include getting the recording out to everybody, sending you any follow-up review and actions. And we'll send that whole packet. Our goal is always to have that out within a week of the town hall meeting. All of this information will be reviewed tomorrow. We'll be debriefing the meeting and planning our next meeting. So really excited to hear what everyone has to say. And finally, our guidelines and communication rules. So in order to have the kind of conversation that is productive, we have guidelines and ground rules set up. The first is honesty. We don't get together to debate who's right and who's wrong, but to have an honest conversation, to be able to share what we've experienced, what we think and believe and feel, and to be able to listen to other people's experience and feelings and beliefs. Equality, we do have panelists who come with a certain particular set of skills and knowledge, but we're all equal and valuable contributors to the conversation. Respect, all of us have preconceived ideas and they can get in the way of our listening to each other. So we want to be aware of that so we can remain respectful to each other and ourselves at all times. We want to practice active listening. That can be particularly challenging in a virtual environment, but I encourage us all to try to pay attention to the person who's speaking and give them our attention, as opposed to trying to figure out what we want to say. Responsibility. We all have hot buttons. They can get triggered unintentionally. If it happens, we want to be able to name it without blaming anybody for it. And finally, this is a shame-free zone. Shame never creates change. It only pushes unhelpful, destructive thinking and thoughts deeper. So we want to have this be a place where we're safe to ask the questions that we might not feel comfortable asking, to share the struggles that we've had, and know that we can do that and be accepted with grace and without being shamed. If everybody is okay with the ground rules, we can move forward. So if anybody has a problem, this would be the time to click out and leave the meeting. Just want to give you a moment to be able to do that. If you're still here, then that is your consent. Have a polling question to get us started. And it's a two-part question. The first part is just how confident you are talking about race and racism. Clearly, we want to be helping people have that conversation more and more. And so how comfortable are you on a scale of 1 to 10? If you would just mark that. And then the second question is racism present in our community? Not at all, minimally, somewhat, regularly, or always. So those two questions. We'll take a few seconds to give you a chance. We're slowing down. I'm gonna just give it about 3 more seconds. And once you have to hit the submit button once you've made your selections. All right, and I'm gonna end that polling and show you the results. So as we talk about our level of confidence, 1 meaning I have no confidence, and 10 meaning this is my second language, you can see that we're really scattered all the way from 2 to 10, with quite a few people here in the center. But we also have 20% here, 20, 30% that have complete confidence, so or very close to complete. In terms of whether racism is present in our community, 51% of you are saying that it's regularly present, 35% always, 12% somewhat, and 2% minimally. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on those polls. Next, I'm going to turn this over to our speakers. CE Sikinga is first. So CE, if you would unmute yourself. And I want to recommend, if you haven't already, probably putting it on speaker view, and then you'll be able to see CE at this point.
So can everybody see that?
Yes.
Beautiful. All right, so yeah, my name is CE Sikinga, and I've been teaching at Grand Haven for 29 years. Prior to that, I was a student at Grand Haven from 1985 to 1988. And my journey with journalism started when I was on the Bucksblade staff. And I've been advising that paper now. This is my 21st year. And I've been very involved in our state journalism association. I am the past president. I've been the newspaper chair since 2012. So kind of in charge of contests and standards and all of that. So who we are is The Blade. It's a 100% student produced publication. The kids do all the writing, all the photography, all the web posting, all the social media layout design, etc. And the mix always varies from year to year based on experience and talent, particularly of the editorial staff. But in most years, every story is approved, assigned, and mostly edited by the student leaders. And as advisor, I give advice and I train the staff. But in a great year, last year was a great example of that. We had 4 senior leaders who'd been in our program each since they were freshmen, and they set the tone. So how do we approach race, or maybe how do we approach anything? Certainly that's more of a sensitive topic, or potentially could be. I think first and foremost in our paper, we are storytellers. We are not set up maybe the same way Channel 13 or the Sentinel are. It's difficult, not impossible, for a student publication to react to breaking news and a news cycle. I've got the kids, an hour a day, and whatever they're willing and able to put in at night, knowing they have 5 other classes, often difficult ones. So we're more feature oriented, more timeless, as opposed to timely stories. As I look back, of all the big things we've tackled over the years, we haven't specifically done a big package on race and racism, although we've hit it in smaller ways over the years. But I think hopefully the kind of storytelling we do undermines stereotypes, promotes understanding. When you tell people stories, that, I guess, humanizes seems like too strong a word or too loaded a word, but it promotes a lot of understanding. And it's not just, I think with that, it's not just who we're telling stories about, it's who's telling the stories. I saw this tweet a couple days ago from SPJ, and they said, too often newsroom diversity is a numbers game, a matter of meeting quotas, but at its core, that's not what it's about. It's about journalism that accurately and meaningfully reflects what's going on in an increasingly diversified country, or in our case, an increasingly diversified high school community of somewhere between 1,600 and 2,000 kids and adults, depending on the year. So we do try to promote diversity on our staff, both, racial and ethnic diversity, but also diversity of thought, diversity of ideas. I think if you talk to kids that have been our staff, the things that they love the most are just the conversations that go on in the room. It does function in a lot of ways more like a newsroom than a classroom. Once you get past the first couple of months, there's not a lot of direct instruction. It's coming in and getting to work. So just I could show you a few of the bigger issues we've covered over the years. And I know these don't all hit on racism, but they might give you an idea of the scope of what.
We might have lost CE. Why don't we go ahead and if you have questions for CE, put them in the chat box and we will return to that. I imagine he'll probably log out and log back in. And in the meantime, let's go ahead and Kylie, if you would begin your 10-minute presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Kylie Ambu, and I'm a multi-skilled journalist for WZZM 13. Basically, what I do for the station is I handle the camera, the scripting, and the on-camera work as well. So every day we get pitched a story, or we can pitch stories as well, but it's ultimately up to our managers which stories reporters cover. And basically I go out with my camera in hand and go and interview folks, package up a story together by writing a script and doing the editing. I will front it live on air, and that is kind of a day in the life of a reporter. Now, in addition to that, I'm also on our diversity and inclusion task force. And so today I thought I'd give you guys a look at some of the things that we are talking about, not only how news stations are working, but how we specifically are working to combat racism and the different, I think, items that we find are really important. And those are in 3 key areas right now that I'm kind of summing up, and that's with representation, relationships, and response. When we talk about representation in the media, I think a lot of people, specifically in like TV and movies, it's more of a topic of diversity. I think we think what different people are we seeing of different backgrounds, of different colors. And while that is great, I think for me personally growing up, I saw Asian characters sometimes on screen, but I definitely didn't see them in lead role positions. So I didn't grow up really thinking that I was the main character. And I think that that happens all too often, not in just TV and movies, but you look at in news as well, and you think about hard news, which is actually real life, and how detrimental that can be to communities of color who can have stereotypes pushed against them, or again, feel like they're not the main character here. So for me, I guess the difference of just representation in terms of diversity would be diversity paired with inclusion. We have that famous quote by Brene Myers, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. We don't just need communities of color to be on our airwaves. We need communities of color to have their narrative fully told. And they need to not just be invited to the table, but asked in the conversation how they need to be portrayed and how that narrative can be fully told instead of just one side of the story. For us, what we've talked about a lot is that goes into what kind of stories we decide to cover. If you look at breaking news, we don't really have a choice but to cover things that might be shootings in areas or robberies or negative impacts. When that happens, and maybe 6 times in a row, it is a white individual doing that crime, we've seen communities not judge an entire white race based off of that action. But we have seen when a shooting happens and it happens to be a person of color, those entire communities get judged by one perpetrator. And I think a huge way that we, as the media, who we do need to cover that, because if there's a gunman on scene, no matter the color, we have to be able to tell people, we have to be able to keep people safe. We need to be able to handle that balancing act and understand, are we only going to this specific community when negative things happen? Because there are amazing things happening in our communities of color, just like there are amazing things happening in the white communities. And I think we need to be really mindful that when we cover negativity, maybe even a little, in communities of color, those judgments last years and years and years. And so I think what we really need to be doing is creating a balancing act and saying, you know, we're not getting the whole story here. Something negative may have happened in this community or in this specific city even, because I think we see a lot of disparity too in the different areas in West Michigan. But you know, there's a family who's adopting a foster family of 6 after years of process. We need to go tell that great story. There's a backpack drive for kids. We need to go tell that great story. And we need to be able to tell that entire narrative instead of one snippet. And I think in order to do that, that brings us to our next topic, which is relationships. In order to be able to get a hold of those stories and really feel like we're telling them well, we need to foster relationships with communities that we serve in. There's such a distrust right now. I think everybody on this call knows it, between the media and other people out in the world, the public. And I think when you go into communities who have long felt misrepresented by media, it really is on us as reporters, as journalists, to mend those relationships and to reach out that hand and say, you can trust me, and I'm going to prove it to you by telling your full story. We as stewards of news and of the community owe that to people. And that's one thing that we're working on in our task force right now with WZZM 13. We have created a task force internally to kind of combat some internal biases and to have these discussions. But then we've also reached out to our community. So we have Black business leaders, we have representatives from the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, et cetera, that are joined on this panel that we will go to every now and then to say, how are we doing? Keep us accountable, but also talk with us. And they've graciously agreed to help better our relationships with the community and be able to tell us where those stories are that maybe aren't getting told and where they are that could really be told a lot better. And in doing that, I think that's a wonderful thing to have those relationships. But I also think we need to be real and say that it's not enough to have one good relationship with one city commissioner of color and say that's it. We need to be able to connect with the entire community, be able to build that bridge of trust. And it's a great starting point because those people know people who know people who know people. And eventually you do get that community of trust. But I think it's not good enough to expect one person of one race to have the same viewpoints as everybody else. I'm Asian American, but I know that I can go up to somebody else of Asian descent and have a completely different opinion on what might be going on in the world right now, what might have been going on during some of the racism we saw during the coronavirus when it was at its peak. And I think we need to understand that and put that into attention when we're talking to communities of color, that isn't just a one view lens. It can be viewed in many different ways. And I think in order to have those strong relationships, we go to our last level, which is response. Because of all of the misrepresentation that has happened in the past, we as journalists need to step up. I mean, we need to step up years ago. I think we all have learned through the past few years that we have been needing to step up, everyone, whether you're a journalist, whether you're a doctor, et cetera, and defend people against racism and speak with people and really be allies. I think by participating in diversity and inclusion groups, we are furthering that and we are looking into our internal biases. I think I'm in no way saying that, hey, mistakes happen. If it does, we got to all kind of band together and get over it, because some mistakes are detrimental and absolutely are unacceptable. But I think when we can understand that mistakes are going to happen, we also as media representation need to take ownership of that and not only admit to saying, hey, we misrepresented you in this way, but say, what can we do to fix that so that doesn't happen in the future? I'm sorry that you brought us this story that was done 10 years ago and you're not happy and you're saying that this is a learning element. What can we do to make that better in 2020 as we're moving forward? I think that while it is on us as journalists to be able to outreach that hand, I'm really counting on the subjects and that they can just try to trust us and we can earn their trust. I think it's a team effort, but it definitely starts with us as journalists to make sure that we're telling a complete and accurate representation of different communities.
Excellent. Thank you, Kylie. Please put your questions for Kylie in the chat box, and we'll return to those after we've heard from all of our speakers. I do see that CE is back on, and I'm not sure how much time you had left, but why don't we go ahead and let you wrap up, CE, and then we'll go to Sarah. So CE, are you?
I am here.
Okay.
So I'm not going to screen share anymore. I would just say, I think very similar to what Kylie was saying in a lot of ways, you know, we try to get to know our community within our school and think about what are, one of the messages I send to the kids at the start of the year when we're starting to really think about how each staff's going to be different is what are the voices and the messages out there that you think you need to amplify and that you want to amplify? What are the stories that need to be told? And normally the really big in-depth pieces they'll work on for 3, 4, or 5 months, depending on, once again, the experience of the staff. So last year, one of the big pieces that we did was on refugee kids that were at our school, and they interviewed and just very simply told their stories and what they had been through to get here. And our room and Ben Lawrence, who is our English as a second language teacher, and he works with our migrant kids, our refugee kids. We've always had a very strong relationship between our staff in his room and our kids. And many years we'll go in there and hang out and get to know those kids. Remember, we had an editor-in-chief a few years ago, came back from interviewing someone who said, oh my gosh, I just made a whole bunch of new friends. And then suddenly starts to see those stories. And out of that, she did some reporting on what the kids in our migrant communities face. So that's kind of a big focus for us, is just how do we find those stories? What are the voices that need to be heard? Who have the stories that are, you know, truly interesting and that are maybe overlooked? Yeah, we cover the football team too, obviously, and the student senate and the choirs, but I think those stories are kind of right up there in front of you a lot of times, so there is a little bit more digging. So that's where we are coming from.
Excellent. Thank you, CE. And I know there are questions for you. There are questions for Kylie. Let's go ahead and hear from Sarah, and then Jenna will take us through the questions. So Sarah, if you would unmute yourself. Sarah here from the Holland Sentinel.
Okay, I'm going to do my screen share and hopefully everything goes the way we tested it. Okay. Can everybody see my slides? I hope. Maybe.
I can actually see them this time.
Okay, yay. All right.
I have no idea why.
It's a miracle. All right. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is I knew that I was going last, and I know that I'm kind of coming from a print legacy media perspective, which is similar in some ways and is slightly different in others, because it's a traditional print background. We do have the benefit of being able to have a lot more transparency and policy expectations. And so we also are in the unique position where we oftentimes find ourselves in the middle of the struggle of a community that might be changing. Particularly in West Michigan, I happen to be from the east side of the state, and I grew up with a pretty broad wealth of diversity in all sorts of ways. And when I moved here 20 years ago, it struck me as nice and quaint. It's beautiful, but it also does not have a lot of diversity. And watching that struggle over the time that I've spent here, particularly working in media, has been challenging, fulfilling in a lot of ways, but also frustrating. And I think that one of the things that newspapers especially themselves in the middle of is trying to reconcile the community's struggle with itself. And the ways that we have found to be able to work within that is to show that we have some guidelines that we try to adhere to. Some of these are developed in our own newsroom, and some of them are given to us from our ownership. We happen to be a Gannett publication, which is part of the USA Today network. And so we have transparency policies that are posted on our website in order for people to comment with us, in order to engage with us. We have seen this summer especially a lot of issues surrounding racism and the Black Lives Matter movement, and they're not always what you think they might be. There are people who really do not want this to happen. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to talk about it, and they don't want to read about it. And so we find ourselves in this position where we have an obligation to bring the information to the readership, to tell them what's going on in their community, because that ultimately that is our purpose. But then you also have to try to figure out how to engage that community, because they're also your readers, and you're trying to figure out a way to reach them as much as possible. And so we have these transparency policies in order to kind of equalize the system, so to speak, so that everyone knows what the rules of engagement are. We also have a lot of implicit bias in this industry. I think that we're all journalists. We all found out in journalism school that we, as human beings, we all have these internal judgment mechanisms, and there's nothing particularly wrong with that per se. But as journalists, we also have to learn how to manage those implicit biases within ourselves in order to do our jobs effectively. And we also have to diversify our workforce, which can be challenging in this area. Trying to recruit talent that wants to work in a predominantly white community has been a particular challenge for our newsroom. And we have to have these fair hiring practices so that we can try to represent the community better. We have a 30% Hispanic population in the Holland area, and it's not really well reflected in a lot of institutions, including at the newspaper. And then we're also trying to find ways to minimize behaviors that could reinforce racial stereotypes, such as using mugshots. That's something that has come up over the summer, particularly in light of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I'm going to just show you guys a little bit of some of the things that we look at when we're trying to figure out what we want to cover. And so we determine what stories we pursue, because we have a minimal staff. And so we have to be able to really try to, really get the bang for our buck. We have 8
and your audio is starting to break up.
Oh no.
So continue, but I also am hearing that your slides aren't visible again.
Is that better? I can just tell you. Yeah, I can just tell you guys what's on the slides. So can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so the 8 news values are impact, weight, timeliness, proximity, prominence, conflict, novelty, and usefulness. And I don't have enough time to get into all of those specific factors, but they are all of equal import when we're looking at stories, determining how many people things affect, how deeply it affects them, how close it is to the area that we serve, whether or not it's something that's unique. You get the main gist. So those are the things that we look to evaluate what we decide to cover. And so when we don't necessarily try to pick and choose something that's particularly about race, unless it is something that we think might have hit on some of these broader traits in terms of something that people really would find interesting, something that would really would resonate with people. And that's kind of the way that we approach the general idea of race. Gannett has an interesting history with some of the policies that it's put in place in the past. In 2002, I went to a newspaper in Virginia, and I worked there for about 18 months, and so it was a pretty challenging economic time. Gannett had in place a policy that was called mainstreaming, and what the ideal was to try to challenge newsrooms to get an appropriate number of minorities represented as sources for stories and also in news coverage. The problem was that this was sort of a one-size-fits-all approach. And there were many communities that were unable to meet those guidelines, and often would find one or two people who were people of color, and then would re-interview them over and over and over again. So then a different problem arose, where there was a lot of criticism and backlash about those kinds of policies, because I think that the intent was genuine, and they were trying to affect positive change. However, the execution of it just really kind of fell apart at the end, because they weren't really measuring results and evolving the strategy as they were getting some feedback as to how it was working. The Sentinel doesn't have any particular policies that are explicitly about race. Like I said before, we do have policies about our processes in general, complaints, errors, letters to the editor, commenting rules, so that we can have a safe place for people to come, and what the rules of engagement are. In terms of a workforce diversity, I think that we have a lot to be desired, quite frankly. In my company in 2002, they had about 17% representation of people of color work in the workforce in newsrooms. And here we are 18 years later, it is up to 22%. However, based on the number of actual reductions in work in newsrooms across the country, that still only ends up being about 1,100 people when it was about 1,000 people 18 years ago. So that we obviously have a long way to go in terms of really representing, the communities that we serve in earnest on our staffs. And finally, I don't know if anybody has followed the story, but MLive decided to change its use of what we call mugshots, police headshots, when reporting on crime, because there's a lot of criticism about the fact that these images do reinforce racial stereotypes. And my company hasn't followed suit yet, but I know that that's being discussed, and I wouldn't be surprised if that gets enacted as well. But I think that those are the kinds of things that we need to look at in terms of what can we do to show that we are a part of the community, that we're supportive of the community, but that we're also sort of the great equalizer in terms of how those different sections of the communities are represented, and that they somehow engage productively with one another.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Jenna, I know that there were a couple questions that have come in ahead of time, and there are also questions in the chat. If you could direct your questions, the questions we've received, to the appropriate person. And CE, Sarah, and Kylie, you're all on deck.
All right. So for CE, the first one, how have attitudes about race among your students evolved over the years that you've taught?
Oh, you're still on mute.
In general, I'd say the trend has been pretty positive. When I started, I don't know the exact statistics, but I believe Grand Haven High School was 95% or higher white. And that number is considerably different now. So kids in their day-to-day life are experiencing much more diversity, and they're much more curious toward it and much more positive toward it, I would say, than at any time since I've been involved with Grand Haven High School, which is most of my life, which is not to say racism doesn't remain a persistent problem in our community and our school community, but definitely much more curious, much more tolerant, and much more interested.
Thank you. Thank you, CE.
And then another question for you. Are there plans for tackling the subject of racism this school year, considering it being an ongoing issue plaguing our community?
There aren't specifically at the moment. Right now, we're just, to be honest, with the craziness of this school year and our situation, just trying to do training and put a staff together. It's very definitely a possibility for later, but as far as some of those bigger, heavier pieces, those conversations haven't even happened yet in our staff room. But we're a very small staff this year, 14 kids. Our newspaper and our yearbook are running together at the same time, and we're really focused on teaching kids how to be journalists right now. Above all, I think we have 5 returning veterans back on our Bucks Blade staff, so it's a little different situation in a lot of ways to share.
All right. And then how often do you and the student staff get pushback from your administrators, parents, community in general?
I tell you what, our administration is fantastic. From day one, they have supported anything we want to do. We will hear criticism sometimes after the fact, but and what actually happens with a student paper is, rather than call us, they call the principal's office if somebody has a complaint. And I've advised under 2 different principals, and they have been wonderful. And we've had some issues pop up. As far as community goes, you do hear it sometimes, especially when we've done some controversial stories. But I've also had parents come up to me at a basketball game and say, "Hey, that story about such and such was not what I wanted my kids to be reading in their school newspaper," to which I would say, well, it's a student newspaper, not a school newspaper. And I think that difference is important. But parents have said, we sat down and had a conversation around the dinner table because of the story. And I'm glad we did. So thank you for bringing it up. So the community's been by and large very supportive as well. And I do think no matter what the story is, if you tell it well and fairly and accurately, there tends to be not that much blowback. But it could be the smallest story in the world and you get a name wrong and there's blowback, which is a great lesson for kids and any journalist.
Thank you,
All right. And then the last question for you specifically, how are you helping to form future news people who can fairly report events without bias?
It's hard because, as Sarah and Kylie said, we all have our implicit biases, and we don't have a lot of training in how to recognize those and deal with them. I think the one thing we try to do, anything that's very sensitive goes through a lot of drafts and a lot of discussions with kids. And it's really the conversations we're having every day in class. I think part of any teacher's job is to always be the devil's advocate and be asking students to consider perspectives that they hadn't considered, even if you agree with the perspective that they are showing. So it's a lot of talking and conversing and building relationships. And we are lucky. A lot of times I'll have students 3 and 4 years in a row, and before they take on the really heavy stuff, we've been having these conversations for 2 and 3 years. Generally speaking, the kid that just walks into staff their first year probably isn't going to be writing the more sensitive stories until they've been trained. But it's hard.
Thank you. Okay, next we have questions for Kylie. Does WZZM's ownership send you must runs that you have to broadcast, or is all your content locally determined?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. For as far as I know, because I'm not always the one making that decision, I want to be completely transparent. That is mostly a decision. What we run is between our news director, managers, and then producers. As far as I know, we do not get sent must-run content. We're owned by a company called Tegna. But I will say it's a great question because I have friends who work for other stations that are owned by different companies, and they are sent must-runs that kind of from the top are said, yep, you've got to air it. So I know that it does happen. For us at our station, I don't believe that it does. We do run national stories, but most of those are hand selected by our producers saying, hey, this is a great story out of Washington or out of wherever, or this is happening right now and we've got the coverage of it down there. So we're going to pull that story for our news waves. So locally, we do make that decision. And then ABC is our affiliate. They do have permission to come in and cut us off of our airwaves to break into what we would call national coverage. So if President Trump is speaking, if there's a debate going on, they will kind of cut into our showtime to air that.
Okay, thank you. And then are you frustrated with 30-second sound bites being used to report news items?
Oh man. Yeah, if you ask a journalist, I think anyone, specifically TV, like we all wish we had more time to tell these stories. And it's really frustrating because our shows are only about an hour long, sometimes 30 minutes. And when you have 5 reporters working that day, you are just pretty tight with content. So there are times where we get up to 2 minutes, maybe 2 minutes and 30 seconds to tell a full story if we are lucky. But sometimes we are tasked with telling a story and you have 30 seconds worth of a soundbite to use. So it's definitely frustrating. I think you beat yourself up over the head sometimes thinking, how do we have this, accurate portrayal in this amount of time? But I think a way that we can combat that is I tell all of my subjects, don't freak out because we did like a 15-minute interview and only a few seconds will be shown. The rest of it will be in our web story. And so that's what we generally do is we'll write out more content. Barbara, I did this for you when we had an interview and the soundbite was quick, but we had a full discussion of it in our web story. And I know that some news outlets as well are gearing more towards sharing an entire interview. We do that at times and we'll post that to like our YouTube page and tell people that they can go there if they want the full interview.
Awesome. And then someone commented that your thinking is progressive and it's wonderful. To what degree are you able to influence your station?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. And then to the degree of influence at a station, as you can imagine, I'm one of the younger ones at our station. And also being a minority, it sometimes feels a little scary to speak up. I think that our diversity and inclusion task force has given some of our minority workers more of a voice than ever before. It's been, because I'm being completely transparent here, it was amazing when we had our first meeting and we had one of our managers there and we all had a safe space to just really air out all the things that we said, we should have done this different, or I'd like to see this being implemented. I think by creating a group like that, the degree in which we are able to influence actual change at our station has gone up considerably. We're still pretty new, but I'm excited that our managers have taken a step to not only allow us to have that group, but also to participate and listen to it.
Thank you. And next we have Sarah. And I think you might have mentioned this when you were speaking, but maybe just clarify again in case someone missed it. But how many people of color do you have in your newsroom? And then when it comes to recruiting, hiring a more diverse staff, do you aim for equality or equity?
Yeah, I think I mentioned the stats of my company overall, but not my specific newsroom. So I actually have a pretty small staff, but technically my people of color percentage is 20%. So, it's all kind of relative to what the numbers are. And the people of color who I have working for me are not people who are reflective of the community that we cover. And so that's the challenge. And we last year actually merged with Gannett. So this is a new development. So at the beginning of the year is when we actually became Gannett. Overall, my company bought their company. And I think it's going to change. It's been so frustrating to try to get people to come to West Michigan, and there's no knock against West Michigan. It's a tough sell. It's a tough sell for people to go into journalism in the first place. Not a lot of people are. I can see in the chat that some people are talking about the students that are going to J school, whether or not they are representative ethnically of the country. But overall, J school numbers are down. It's not a high-paying industry. It's often a very stressful industry, and people tend to burn out rather quickly because of all of those factors. And then trying to get somebody who might have grown up in a diverse climate or location and try to get them to move to a predominantly white community, it's a challenge. But I do see a ray of hope that the fact that we are a bigger company now, we have a lot of pipelines that previously were not available to us. And so we're actually in the hiring process right now for an assistant sports editor. And I was very encouraged by the depth of resumes that I got, and I mean it was wonderful to see, because sometimes you put a job posting out there and 4 people answer it, and you're just wondering, how can I reach other people? I don't necessarily go for the goal of a diverse hire. I still have to keep in mind that we obviously want the best person for the job that we're hiring for, and so you want somebody that's got a really strong skill set. Regardless of gender or racial makeup. And obviously you can't ask those kinds of questions because it's illegal. But it is kind of I feel good about the fact that we are reaching more people, that we do have some of these other voices on our staff, and we do have a lot of interesting conversations about race and gender. And I will say that we do have diversity in other ways. We've had a lot of people from the LGBTQ community on our staff, which I think is definitely an underrepresented demographic. And, I think that, younger people, older people, no matter what, as long as you don't have people that are all one thing, I think that that's always a good thing.
Thank you. And then how has the closing of local newspapers changed the conversation regarding racial inequity?
It's been devastating. And I think that that is a huge contributor to some of the deep frustration that we've obviously seen, not just this past summer. I mean, it was just tapping into it this year, where factors coalesced for it to bubble to the surface. But we saw it in 2014. We've seen it before that as well. When you don't have media or local newspapers in an area, it creates what's known as a news desert. And so it actually underserves the entire community. But because people of color are a particular group that tend to not necessarily engage with the media regularly anyway, it's even harder to get them information so that they understand what's going on with their government so that they can engage with that government, that they can react to some of the decisions that are being made in their name, because, you know, obviously government represents the public. I think that without that kind of transparency and accountability, especially for institutions that obviously we've been talking about all year a lot in the media, those kinds of conversations don't take place, and that kind of accountability doesn't take place. And I'm not really sure what the answer to that is. The public is very skittish about trusting the media. I think that a lot of people in positions of power have done a lot of damage in terms of whether or not to trust the media. And so it makes our jobs even that much harder. And so we just do everything that we can to try to think about what we're doing, do it with intent, have good conversations with one another to make sure that we're on the right path, and don't be afraid to question yourself and the things that you're doing, and shake things up so that you can reach more people.
Excellent. We are continuing to get questions in. I know there's a couple for everybody and some more for Sarah. We're not going to be able to get to all of the questions because we need to go into our group discussion. But Jenna, if you could ask one of the questions that is being directed to all of our panelists, and if you could all just kind of make a concise reply. And then we can always answer in more detail in writing afterward and get that out to the participants. So Jenna, if you have a final question.
Yep. So what advice can you give people about how to digest or process race in the media? In which ways might we be cautious?
Oh, good, a short one.
Somebody else want to go first?
I can go. I would say that one was one of the, I feel like, the hardest questions to answer, because I think we as journalists, I don't want to speak for you guys, we're processing it. I mean, we every day when we read articles, but I would say keep an open mind, look at things from different vantage points. If there's something you don't agree with, don't be afraid to reach out to your news organizations and share that viewpoint. Also, it gets pretty rough in the comments section. Don't be afraid to take breaks for your own mental well-being. And I know this wasn't a portion of the question, but you can shape the way that things are covered or what is covered. So if you know of something that's going on in marginalized communities, share that with us. We get our information from viewers.
Thank you, Kylie. Someone else?
Yep. Don't rely on a single source, obviously. But I also think across the board, especially for younger kids who have grown up in a very different media environment than I did, media literacy is kind of at a low right now. I think I grew up knowing how a newspaper works, how a TV broadcast works, just because you were bombarded with them every day. So research it a little bit. I would love to see media literacy be a part of the school curriculum. I think it's an essential skill right now that is falling between the cracks.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was going to just basically say something very similar. I think that it's the same thing when we talk about fake news, what you're talking about is media literacy. You have to diversify your news diet, and even something that has a prestigious reputation like the New York Times, the Washington Post, they also can get groupthink sometimes. They also can kind of be on in a one-track mind and not really kind of take in on other information. And so reading the same topic or coverage of an event at 3 or 4 different major media organizations can actually provide you a lot of, sometimes it feels like you're reading about a different event. It kind of depends on because journalists are human too. And so they're taking what they're seeing, they're prioritizing information the way that they think that their readers or viewers want to learn about. And And so nobody is perfect and no one place is perfect. And so if you diversify that input, then I think that you're going to get a broader perspective about how to really think and feel about it, you know, for yourself. Because really, we're not telling you what to think. We're telling you what to think about.
That is an excellent segue to our first question for our breakout. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to, you're going to all be assigned to a different breakout room. There'll be a facilitator in each of those rooms. It might be one of our speakers or one of our members of the Anti-Racism Task Force. And you'll have time in that group to talk. Our facilitators know the questions, but I'm going to let you know what they are and I'll broadcast them. And the first one is, where do you get your news and information? And how do you confirm what you read and watch? So that's the first question. I will send you into breakout rooms. Zoom has changed, so it might send you automatically, or it might ask you to click a button that'll send you to your room. But either way, I'm going to open those rooms up now. And if you do see something that says click here to join, please join. And I'll also broadcast the question. And we'll take and introduce yourself to each other. So we'll say 6 minutes for this first question. Welcome back, people. Good to see you all. So what we're going to do is just a quick check-in with the facilitators. And again, we have like 10 groups, so we don't want to take a minute each because that's 10 whole minutes. We just want to hear kind of an aha or a sense of the mood of the conversation, just a quick reflection, because we do have one more question that is really pertinent to our future planning. But we want to hear everybody just kind of check in briefly. So if you unmute yourself as I call on you. First, room 1, Ben.
So my big takeaway is that we have confirmation bias in the media. We are looking a lot for what we want to see sometimes, and we get caught in these echo chambers, but the media is also human in its own right, and they're trying the best that they can. So understanding that these are all people, these aren't some like information machines making decisions for you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. How about room 2, Mary Jane?
We talked a lot about subscribing to credible journalism, but then talking about it with your friends. Did you hear what I heard? Some validation about that. And one other thread of the conversation was, if you can also listen to journalism that is being reported by people of color, they might have a different slant on the same story.
Excellent. Thank you, Mary Jane. How about room 3, Greg?
I'm going to just end on the last subject that we were kind of talking about, which is that there was a comment made by one of our folks that the Black Lives Matter movement has also been getting a lot of attention in the media, probably both positive and negative. But our observation was that this was one area that seems to have some legs to it and actually might be getting some very positive movement in terms of the broader country.
Thank you, Greg. How about room 4, CE?
A lot of similar things. One that hasn't been mentioned yet that everybody felt was important is subscribe to and follow your local media. Please, I mean, all news is local, and if we support these, they're going to be there to tell these stories, and if we don't, it's going to continue to be bigger sources with more likely a non-local focus, not owned by local people.
Yeah, good observation. Thank you. How about room 6, Carolyn?
Okay, had to unmute. So one thing, definitely, how are we defining our news? I mean, the news does, is it driving or reacting or interpreting? We've got to really pay attention to that. And we do have a long way to go. As far as that last question, number 3 there, that we really just want more opportunities. We want to get together and talk, and the more conversations, the better, because that's what's shedding the light for all of us.
Excellent, thank you, room 6. How about room 8, Luann?
Hi, a lot of what other people said. One thing that hasn't been mentioned is how the person on the street with the on-site video that gets transmitted almost in real time, as it did with the George Floyd murder, is a game changer. And when that happens, and you get to see what's happening when it's happening, then the job of the media is to get the rest of the story and find the backstory and the history and make a complete package of the information to try to help us suss it. They're no longer necessarily the ones getting to the story first, so it's not about breaking news as much as it is about helping people understand what it was and what caused the problem.
Excellent, excellent. How about room 9, Kylie?
Well, we had slight differences in what kind of news we watch. Some watching local, others saying, you know I have that confirmation bias there, but I'm going to continue to probably keep that with the hostile environment that we're seeing. And some people saying, I want to avoid news altogether because it can be too much. But everyone pretty much agreed that by seeing more diversity on screen, that leads to more diverse stories often being told, and that we just need to be careful not to sensationalize it too much as journalists, to tell true stories and to continue having conversations like these to push forward.
Great, excellent, thank you. How about room 12, Carrie?
Sorry. Most of our group got their information from the different apps now, depending on your age, I suppose, and blogs. There's a really good blog that Daryl likes. Heather Cox Richardson is from Boston College, and she has a blog called Letters from an American, and it gets into very great details and summarizes like the day of news. So that would be a good one to look up. What else that we talked about was not just domestic, but international news, so that we can see the other world's perspective of us. Sometimes that's not real good to see, but it, and number 2, driving diversity. They're seeing more news anchors, more diverse news anchors, and that then go on and have their own shows and spots in the news broadcasting. So that was question 1 and 2.
Thank you, thank you. I'm going to open the rooms up one more time, send you there for just 5 minutes, just to talk about what we can do to create a more inclusive culture as individuals and as a community. And take 5 minutes. Please, facilitators, take down your notes, because I'm not going to have you report out for that. We're going to go into next steps when we come back so we can wrap up. So 5 minutes and 5 only. Go ahead. All right, welcome back again. Thank you so much for participating in that conversation. And facilitators, if you would just make sure that you get your notes to me, and you can get them to me in whatever fashion. You can take a picture and send them, or type them and send them, however is easiest for you, so that we can have those for our debriefing meeting tomorrow. I do have a couple of poll questions to put up for everybody. And the first is our post-meeting poll. So at the end of this conversation, how do you feel about racism's presence in our community? From not at all to always. And what is your level of confidence talking about race and racism on a scale of 1 to 10? And you have to answer both questions and then hit the submit button. 3, 2, 1, end. All right. We asked again about racism being present in the community regularly and always. I think climbed from the first time. And this is nice, level of confidence talking. I know we had a lot more in these 3s and 4s. Now we're up to 35% between 9 and 10. So hopefully this helped. Next poll. is the evaluation. So just how helpful was this? Not at all helpful, made you more aware, invited you to take action, motivated you to take action, or convinced you to continue or become a leader or an advocate. 3, 2, 1. And I'll share those results. We have one person, I think it's been in every town hall since we started the virtual ones on mental illness. We've had one person that has said not at all helpful. But we have 38% with awareness, 36% with action, 47% to become or continue with a leader. Very good. And then another question is about what actions are you willing to take now? So what kind of things are you willing to do in follow-up? Listen, read, watch books, documentaries, podcasts, engage in more conversations about race, engage in conversations with people who are not the same race, participate in a protest, attend or speak at a town hall meeting, attend implicit bias training, get involved in local government like Grand Haven's Human Relations Commission, donate to a group that works for racial justice, join the community book club, or nothing. And you can choose more than one, choose all that apply. And then hit submit. And I'm going to close this in 3, 2, 1. You can see 94% are interested in engaging in continued conversation, and 94% would like to have conversation with people who are not of the same race. Thank you for that. And this is the last, oh, I'm sorry. This one is about another town hall. Would you be willing to participate in another one? And what topics would you be interested in? Organizing or organizations that are addressing racism, historical instances, personal stories, local government, local businesses and the economics of race, the educational system, white privilege, healthcare, mental health care, and the justice system. And again, you can choose as many of those topics as are interesting to you. Next month, our topic will be ethnic intimidation, but we will be building our calendar around your feedback. So it's important to let us know what you're interested in. And I'm going to close this one in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have 100% interested in participating again. And racism in the justice system, 76%. So it looks like ethnic intimidation is a good place to begin that. And this is the last question tonight. And it is, have you voted yet? So we wanted to make sure we made a push for voting, however you vote. Get a sense of how many people have already voted. And if you haven't, just a strong encouragement and reminder, next Tuesday is the day. And 70% have voted and 30% haven't yet, but I imagine you will. So thank you for that. In terms of next steps, whoops, that went the wrong direction. We will be sending the recording, slides, materials. We'll send any questions that weren't answered to the panelists so that we can get their responses to everybody. And the plan is to have that packet out by this time next week. And then, as I said, the Anti-Racism Task Force will meet tomorrow to review all of your feedback, the small group conversation, to look for opportunities for initiatives based on your suggestions, and to plan the next town hall meeting. A couple of suggestions that you might want to consider as follow-up to our topic tonight. One is to watch James Baldwin's I Am Not Your Negro. It's available on Netflix, and it also can be checked out as a digital copy from Loudoun District Library. So really strongly suggest that. And also Grand Valley PBS has a series called Shaping Narratives. There's 4 episodes in that series, about 20 minutes long, and they're based locally here in Michigan. So those are a couple of follow-up steps that we encourage you to consider. And again, you'll get these slides and all of the follow-up. And don't forget to vote. I just want to thank our panelists, C.E. Sickinga, Kylie Ambu, and Sarah Leach. You guys were amazing, wonderful information. Yeah, many claps. Feel free to put reactions on your screen if you'd like to thank them for being here with us tonight. Another thank you to the anti-racism team and all of the organizations and individuals that make up that task force and are doing that work. And until next time, which will be Monday, November 23rd, you can put it on your calendar right now, the 4th Monday of every month, 6:30. Next topic is ethnic intimidation. Look forward to seeing you there. Again, if you have any questions, any correspondence, feel free to follow up. We'll get the packet out to you. And until next time, the divine in me recognizes and bows to the divine in you. Namaste.